Hello, I am Liana Lupas. I'm the librarian, the curator of a scripture collection for the American Bible Society. I'm going to share with you some of my favorite books. I'm going to show them and say a few words about them and hope that you will like them as much as I do. Thank you. This is the first Bible printed in America. The first Bible printed outside of Europe. It's an immensely valuable book. It's irreplaceable. And I love it. The title page explains that it was translated in the Indian language. The Indians for which this was translated were Algonquin Indians, and their specific dialect was called Massachusetts. The man who did the translation and the man who brought the gospel of Jesus Christ to the Massachusetts Indians was John Eliot. Eliot was a graduate of Jesus College in Cambridge, and he could probably have made a great career in England, but he chose to come to the colonies and become a missionary. He landed in America in 1631, and eventually he became the teaching pastor of the church in Roxbury. And he spent the remaining years of his life there. It took him some 10 years to organize his life in America, to take care of his parish, and to start learning the language of the Algonquin tribes living around. By the 1640s, he was proficient enough in the language of the Algonquin Indians to be able to preach to them. He befriended a young Indian boy whom he also baptized and who helped him in the translation of the Bible into Massachusetts. John Eliot pays tribute to him in his letters sent to his friends back in England. And we know his name, it was Job Nesutan. Eliot believed that to be truly Christians, the Massachusetts Indians should have a Bible in their own language. Part of the problem was that Eliot would have to translate it, yes. He would have to get the technical resources and the financial resources to print it. But the other part of the problem was that until Eliot's coming, the Massachusetts Indians were illiterate. Eliot was perfectly conscious of the situation, and he opened schools. He opened 4 schools for them because there was no point in printing the Bible in their language if no one could read it. So the Indians made real progress in acquiring all these attributes of the Western civilization. Part of what the colonists thought that would be good for the Indians was to have them live in villages, not just moving around the territory. Eliot and practically all the other colonists thought of civilization in terms of a permanent residence. And he really tried to do that. The village that his Christian Indians moved into was called Natick. And the Indians that he had converted were known as praying Indians. The first publications that Eliot did for them was a primer to help them start reading. And he also printed a very small catechism. Once he had completed the translation of the Bible, the problem he faced was to get it printed. At the time, the British colonies in North America possessed, for all of them, one printing press. The arrival of this printing press in 1639 is mentioned in the journal kept by Winthrop, the first governor of Massachusetts. It was an event worth thinking about, worth writing about. And this is the press that was used to print the so-called Bay Psalmbook. It was a metrical translation of the Psalms into English. And it was printed in 1640, 1 year after the arrival of the printing press. It was the first book printed in colonial America. There is reason to believe that the press run was 1,700 copies, which would have been about one per family. Of these 1,700 copies, 11 survive. One of them was sold at auction a few years back. We didn't bid for it. It was purchased by a private person, not by a library, and it fetched the record price of $14.2 million. That was that. Obviously, we didn't have 14 million to buy the book. Anyway, so this was the press, the only existing press in the colonies. When Eliot started thinking seriously about having his book printed. To print the book, Eliot needed not only access to the press, he needed paper. And paper was expensive. Eliot had a real talent for fundraising. Once he identified the problem, he also figured out a solution. And he started writing back to England, to his friends, to his former colleagues, to anyone he could think of. And he wrote about the Indians, about their life there, and about the possibilities of evangelizing them and what was needed for that. And then he started sending them progress reports and explaining how he was doing in this activity as a missionary. Eventually, all the reports he sent back to England were printed. And there's a good 41 number of them. And these were circulated. And they rose the conscience of the public in England about what needed to be done and what Eliot was doing. And eventually, in 1649, during the Long Parliament, a decision was passed and it authorized the creation of a corporation in England to help evangelize the Indians. And this corporation raised money for Eliot and sent him money, and it also sent paper, sent a new press, and a printer. Because what's the use of a new press if you don't have a printer who knows how to work with it? So by the middle 1650s, there were 2 printing presses in the Bay Colony of Massachusetts and 2 printers. And the 2 of them started working on the printing of Eliot's Bible. There was a problem with the 2 printers. Samuel Green apparently attempted to divert the affection of the daughter of Marmaduke Johnson, who sued him for that. And eventually Green was fined for doing this. But they reconciled and they kept working on the printing. And by 1661, they had printed the New Testament. And Eliot sent to England a few copies to show how he was doing. And by 1663, they had completed the printing of the Old Testament, and the entire Bible was already printed. And at this point, Eliot sent 20 presentation copies to England, to his supporters, to show that he had done what he had promised to do. He had translated, he had printed the Bible, and so on. The copy we have is one of the 20 presentation copies. It's inscribed here by John Harwood, who was one of the colonists that had gone back to England. And here it has the stamp of Christ's Hospital in London. Was an orphanage. So we know exactly the provenance of this book. It once belonged to one of the former colonies, then it belonged to Christ's Hospital, and finally it was sold at auction. And we purchased it at auction in London. It's one of the most valuable objects in our collection. And it has something else. At the end of the New Testament, it has a metrical translation of the Psalms. John Eliot had been one of the translators of the Bay Psalm book, the metrical version of the Psalms into English. And he also did a metrical translation of the Psalms into Algonquin. He created a literary language for them, he created poetry for them, he taught them reading and writing. A few years after the publication of Eliot's Indian Bible, the Indians he had converted were caught in King Philip's wars. They were caught between the other Indians and the colonists. And they were made to abandon their own territory, move to Deer's Island. Some of them died. Most of them lost their Bibles during these troubled times. In When things went back to normal, Eliot printed a second edition of the Massachusetts Bible to replace the copies that had been lost. And this second edition was issued in 1685. And we also have 2 copies of the second edition.